And now, here is your pandemic news report.
Welcome to the Fauci Files. In today's explainer, we're taking a deep dive into the high-stakes, unfolding investigation into exactly how the official story of the pandemic was formed. You know, for years, we've heard the whispers, the rumors, the wildly conflicting reports, but today we're completely setting aside the noise. We're looking strictly at the hard data, the exact timelines, and the under-oath testimony that is literally reshaping our understanding of those early days. I mean, the stakes here really couldn't be higher, right? Because the narrative surrounding this global event directly impacts our trust in public health worldwide. Okay, let's dive into this. How did the official story of COVID-19's origins actually take shape? Because for years, we, the public, were largely presented with a singular, unwavering narrative. We were told, hey, it's a closed case. But as new emails, documents, and testimonies continue to come to light, we're seeing a much more complex and, frankly, a completely fascinating picture emerge. We're going to explore the rapidly shifting scientific consensus, the massive amounts of money moving behind the scenes, and the intense debates happening right now at the absolute highest levels of government. Section 1. The bipartisan COVID investigation. Seeking facts over politics. So, recently, the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic kicked off a series of highly anticipated hearings. And what makes this committee so incredibly fascinating is the rare apolitical agreement between lawmakers. Both Democrats and Republicans have vowed to keep this investigation entirely free of political bias and anchor it firmly in hard science. As Chairman Brad Wenstrup emphasized, this is serious business. Extremely serious business, apolitical, serious business. The committee is absolutely determined to separate genuine scientific inquiry from partisan politics. They've actually made it a major priority to avoid labeling things as conspiracy theories just because of disagreements. They are focusing entirely on getting to the absolute bottom of the facts, no matter where they lead. And that brings us to the two main theories being evaluated by the intelligence community today: natural animal exposure versus a laboratory-associated incident. Now, the intelligence community's 2023 threat assessment makes it very clear that all agencies view both of these hypotheses as highly plausible explanations for how the pandemic began. However, actually arriving at a definitive answer, that has proven incredibly challenging. The global investigation has been severely hindered by a massive lack of transparency and cooperation from China. Without full access to early patient data, laboratory records, and those crucial environmental samples from the first few weeks, investigators are basically forced to piece together a giant puzzle while missing several of the most important pieces. And honestly, that's exactly why these bipartisan hearings are absolutely crucial right now. Section 2. Defining gain-of-function research, the core of the controversy. So the crucial point is, to truly understand the current allegations and this intense debate over a potential lab leak, we first have to understand the specific science that's under the microscope. Let's break this down into practical layman's terms. Gain-of-function research is essentially the scientific process of tweaking or modifying viruses to better understand how they work and hopefully predict their future behavior. Think of it like putting a virus in a biological gym to see just how strong or how contagious it could potentially get. By forcing a virus to evolve in a controlled setting, scientists hope to stay one step ahead of the next outbreak. Now, the reason this definition is so central to our explainer today is that this exact type of research was being conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology right before the pandemic hit. Lawmakers are now actively debating whether the regulations and oversight around this specific high-risk practice need a massive overhaul. Section 3. The February 2020 timeline. A rapid shift in scientific consensus. Let's flash back to the critical early days of 2020 to see exactly how the public narrative was shaped behind closed doors. The sheer pace at which scientific opinions changed during this window is, frankly, staggering. Let's walk chronologically through this timeline together. On February 1st, 2020, 11 prominent scientists joined an urgent conference call where some explicitly warned that the virus possessed really unusual features and might have escaped from a lab. But look at what happens just 3 days later, on February 4th. A handful of those exact same scientists who were literally just discussing a lab leak suddenly drafted a paper known as The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, expressing full, unyielding support for a natural origin. Then, on February 8th, an internal email revealed that the team was actually focused on disproving the lab leak theory altogether, seemingly way before all the global data could possibly be gathered. Yet months later, on August 18th, a formal letter claimed that these scientists had objectively weighed all evidence. This incredibly rapid about-face, happening in mere days, is exactly what's fueled so much suspicion. and prompted the current congressional inquiry. Section 4. Grants and shifting narratives following the financial ties. This timeline leads us directly into the core allegations raised in the recent hearings. Lawmakers are exploring whether government financial ties to gain-of-function research might have actually prompted this sudden dramatic shift in the scientific narrative. As presented in the hearings, key scientists who drafted that natural origin paper and who subsequently changed their initial views regarding a lab leak, they received millions in federal grants. Now, to be completely clear and impartial here, the timeline alone doesn't prove anything malicious, right? Correlation is not causation. However, it has absolutely sparked serious concerns and really intense questioning among committee members about potential conflicts of interest. The fundamental question they're asking is whether this highly lucrative funding might have influenced the scientific conclusions that were ultimately presented to the global public as absolute fact. Now, what's really interesting about this quote is the testimony from former CDC Director Robert Redfield. He testified under oath, saying, "I was left out of key conversations because I had a different view." Redfield, who was leading the nation's premier public health agency at the time, stated that he was completely sidelined by other top health officials simply because he believed the virus leaked from a laboratory. This testimony is absolutely pivotal. It suggests that rather than having an open, rigorous scientific debate where all hypotheses were thoroughly tested, opposing viewpoints might have been intentionally boxed out of the conversation. When leading voices are excluded just for having a dissenting hypothesis, that raises massive red flags about how scientific consensus is manufactured during a crisis. Section 5. Conspiracy or public health. Two competing perspectives. As these revelations continue to unfold, we're seeing two very distinct ways experts are interpreting the data, and it's super important we look impartially at both sides to understand the full scope of the debate. On one hand, you have experts who view this as a coordinated maneuver. Dr. Peter McCulley argues, we have a giant conspiracy on our hands. It's all in the emails and documentation. So from this viewpoint, the shifting timelines, the scrub drafts, and the sudden reversal of scientific opinion, they all represent a deliberate, highly coordinated effort to spin the narrative. Proponents of this view argue that key officials had a vested interest in protecting the funding pipeline for risky virology research, and therefore they intentionally shaped public perception away from a lab leak just to avoid intense regulatory scrutiny. But on the flip side, is assigning blame really the right path forward? Several experts and lawmakers urge intense caution against going down that road. They argue that the focus should remain squarely on pandemic preparation, rather than villainizing public health officials who are essentially operating in the fog of war during an unprecedented global emergency. Their perspective is that hunting for bad actors or trying to assign malicious intent is just a dangerous distraction. Instead of pointing fingers, they argue we should be focusing all of our energy on the vital, life-saving work of structurally preparing our healthcare system, bolstering our supply chains, and establishing really robust response protocols for future global crises. Section 6. Preparing for future pandemics, the bipartisan path forward. So what does this all mean, and why does it matter to you and me today? Well, because lawmakers are actively trying to translate these explosive hearings into concrete preventative action. Despite their differences, the committee has actually found common ground on some major bipartisan solutions. First, there's a unified push to reform gain-of-function research standards globally, implementing far stricter oversight and safety protocols for these biological gyms we talked about earlier. Second, there's a major legislative push to force the declassification of intelligence community information regarding COVID's origins, ensuring total public transparency. And third, doing all of this while still carefully protecting our vital intelligence sources and methods. The goal here isn't just to solve the mystery of the past, but to establish a much, much safer framework for the future of global scientific research. Which leaves us with this final critical question. With intelligence finally being declassified, will we ever know the complete truth about the origins of COVID-19? The investigation is ongoing, and the world is watching closely as the facts continue to unfold. Thank you for watching Pandemic News Report.
And now, here is your pandemic news